Okay, so response profiler hints and tips exercises. So this is the main presentation we're going through today. So what I'm hoping to cover in these slides will be what is response profiler. Now I think everyone on the call is pretty familiar with it, but hopefully it gives just a bit of background in terms of where we're starting from. A set of typical questions we might be looking at as we're dealing with response profiler. So any changes to demand, what happens if we vary the resource levels, some discussion a little bit around this dispatch logic and how that can impact performance, and then double crewing. There's then a final piece about the interpretation of results. So really, by the end of this, we've sort of got 5 or 6 different sort of hints and tips we want to take through, and hopefully that all makes sense as we go. So I think I'm speaking to people who very much know about response profiler, so I'm not going to spend too long on there, but it's a simulation model that mimics police response processes. 3 things it's really doing is testing alternative policies, evaluating changes to operating practices, and optimization of resource availability, for example, setting minimum staffing levels or testing shift patterns. So I think actually who's on the people on the call will know this, but if anybody's watching, really this presentation is pitched to people who use the software. If you're new to the software, it might hopefully be useful as we go through. And then for the expert users, there might be some hints and tips, but we'd appreciate your thoughts saying actually, are there other areas that would be useful to have additional sessions on? Okay, so baseline training model. So what I want to do at this point is to start off with one model that is none of your forces, it's just something we use in the training, and then show how making changes to that model can impact performance. Excuse me. So what we have here is the training model, which some of you will have trained in and be familiar with. So we have an area with 2 districts and 4 beats within it. So Northern, Eastland, Southmead and Westbury, made up of District 1 in blue, District 2 in red. What I've done is I've clipped out the key performance metrics that I would see within the response profiler model. So emergency performance at 83.9, priority slightly higher. We've got the first response times. We've got that first response target split down by district and by beat for emergency priority. And then we've got the overall response utilization, and then the Anytown and Toy Town operational utilization. So how busy are the officers there? And I must say that I'm taking absolutely no credit for the naming convention of Anytown or Toy Town. So that's the key metrics within the model. So one of the things we want to put across here is, what would your superpower be? When we look at the really good users of the tool, what's the 1 or 2 things that they tend to have in common here? And what it tends to be is being able to quickly and accurately put their hands on the answers from each of the scenarios. So it's all very well running the model, but being systematic about the outputs that you've got and being able to compare and contrast. Given that each scenario tends to be one Excel file, it's really easy to get confused, end up with lots and lots of files, and actually not being able to present a very coherent picture as to the changes that have been made. So the first thing we would suggest is, in your baseline model, create a new sheet, and then in that sheet, create a column with all the metrics that you want included, and then just equals and refer to the right cell in there. So by doing that, we can create something called a result sheet and put that in, and that can then be pasted into a scenario manager. And that scenario manager, from my point of view, is the most useful thing about the response profiler project. We can go in, we can easily see the differences and compare across multiple metrics in there. So if we change the demand, yes, we might be interested in the performance, but we're also possibly interested in, okay, well, how much time are people spending traveling to scene? What is the overall utilization, and how has that changed across different areas? So for this, there's not just one number that you might be looking at. So being able to have each of the potential metrics easily identifiable and easy to compare is really useful without having to reopen the models. So if we take one thing from today, scenario repository is really useful. And I know that some of you already do that, but I think it's certainly worth hammering home that message. So one of the things we talk about in policing is, there's been a change to the demand. And I think that it's always useful to think about, what does a change of demand actually mean? So it sounds really straightforward. In our first training example that we'd use, it is very straightforward because we say demand's increased by 10%. What should we do? It would be simple enough just to go into the sheets, into the weekly profile, and change demand for grade 1, grade 2, all the way through, and say add 10%. So multiply the number by 1.1, throw it in, jobs are good in. But actually, if we sit down and think about it a little bit, what do we really mean by demand? And that's where the nuance or the subtlety to the question comes in. What do we really mean by demand? Are we talking about all recorded incidents? Are we talking about all incidents that require an attendance? Or is it just 10% increase in those incidents that response are going to attend? Now, increasing each of these by 10% would give you slightly different inputs, depending on what we're looking at. So it's worth thinking about that. As has already been cited, things like a triage function. If a triage function comes in, it's going to change the dynamics of the demand that's coming through into the model. But it's probably also going to change things as well around process times, because your grade 1s and grade 2s that have been dealt may still be dealt with similarly, but your grades 3, 4, 5s, etc., they might, the ones that are deciding to go to response might have longer lead times, or they might have differences compared to what we see currently. So it's worth taking account of what that 10% increase might mean. On the other side, it's worth thinking about what happens to our non-resource proportion. So in many models, some people might say, actually, we're only modeling everything we go to, so we don't worry about the not resourced. That's fine. But in other models, we might say, actually, we know as a force, we don't go to 4% of grade 1s and 10% of grade 2s. Okay, that's fine. If that's in the model, we need to understand what would happen if that were to change. So we're going to start on that increasing the not resourced. So within the model that we've got here, we've got a sheet in the dispatch code that says, for our emergency and priority incidents, what proportion are not resourced? In the baseline, the answer was 0. We were going to everything. Now, we've got a view that we're going to not resource 20%. So I suppose my first question that I'm going to throw out is, if we don't resource 20% of incidents, what's going to happen to performance? So I'd like you to put a comment in the chat, because we're trying to make this a little bit interactive rather than having to listen to me talk for the whole time. I just want to know what's going to happen to performance if we increase the not resource to 20%. Will the performance increase? Will it stay the same, or will it decrease? I'll give you a moment to put that in. Rob or Peter, could you tell me if there are comments coming through in the chat? I just can't see if I'm presenting at the same time.
Yeah, they're starting to come in. Some people are typing.
Good.
I was going to put my answer in then.
Oof, I'm excited to hear that one.
Only one person seems to be answering at the moment.
Who's that?
Come on, everybody. Okay. Second person's typing. Yeah, that's what I would have put as well. So we've had two answers.
Okay. Right. I'm going to keep going
as well.
I'm hoping everybody's
more. Yeah. More.
I'm hoping people are still there.
Okay.
Right. What do the answers say in the chat then, Rob?
Majority increase or small increase, or perhaps stay the same.
Okay. Wow. Drum roll, please. What we see is it is an increase. If we don't resource those incidents, they're no longer counted. 20% of the incidents are no longer counted in the model. So therefore, we would see an increase in terms of what we've run, 6 points in emergencies and 4 points in priorities, with all of the districts or beats seeing an improvement. By not having 20% of incidents, we see our resource utilization drop. The overall operational utilization of the resources drop by 10 points, which is about 20%. 20% drop there from 51 to 41. So that's what's happening in the model, but there's always that caveat for discussion of, okay, well, if we're not going to these 20%, what does that mean? Are other elements of the force, other functions picking that up, or are there different reasons of why we're not going? And I think the first order piece would be, if we don't resource something, that sounds like it's a fail by the force. So you might have said, oh, well, our performance is going to get worse. And if we think about all the incidents, yes, we're not going to 20%, but within the model, we see performance increase. So that first example there, I think what we're trying to do is highlight the fact that we need to consider both the weekly profile and the dispatch code sheets and the impact, particularly like that around that question around what do we mean by demand? What's been modeled? How's the model been set up? And what's that going to mean going forward? So the second piece, we've touched on demand, but what about what happens when we vary the resourcing levels? So this is an example very close to my heart because we had it a few weeks ago where we sat in a meeting about response numbers, and a call came in, said, actually, there's been a discussion at the Chief Officers Group. We need a level 1 proactive capability. And in this case, we've said we're going to take 10 FTE out of the model. We're going to take 10 people out of response to do something else, in this case, create a tactical capability. How do we do it, and what impact is it going to have? So it's a sort of question that you might come to your desk at some point. So we know from the baseline model that the team operates, it's a 5-team pattern, and there's 2 bases, Anytown and Toy Town. So really there's 3 options here. If we're taking 10 FTE out, we can take 5 from each, or we can take 10 from Anytown or 10 from Toy Town. So how I would think about this in terms of my structure, the structure of my approach would be in column AC in the resources shifts sheet, I'm going to look at that and sum column AC. And from that, I find out there are 4,400 weekly hours, or if we divide that by 40, we get 110 FTE in the model. So it's split across Anytown, Toy Town, teams of 9 and teams of 13. So my approach in terms of how I would look to do the first one, which would be take 5 FTE from each of them, I'm going to have to drop that 9 down to an 8 and the 13 down to 12 in order to take out 10 FTE worth of resource. So the easiest way to do that would be to select all these 9s and then just use the Excel functionality to find and replace. So in this case, I'm not doing the 9s, I'm doing the 13s. Select the 13s, drop them down to 12. Once I've done that, I'd want to check in the model to make sure that when I've done those changes, that my total hours becomes 4,000 and that my FTE would be 100 rather than 110. So effectively, I'm sure that I've taken out those 10 FTE in the model. So using things like find and replace is a systematic way of doing it, and it means that we know what we've done, and we're not having to go through and make sure we've taken properly typed 12 instead of 13 on each of these occasions. So what does that do? If we remove 10 FTE and we're looking at the emergency and priority performance, I've got a baseline model, and then I've got the 3 scenarios that we've used. So removing 5 from each, removing 10 from Anytown, and removing 10 from Toy Town. So in my head, you're thinking, well, it sounds like it's worth taking 5 from each. That way we share the pain. It sounds equitable. But actually, if we think about what the performance looked like to start with, that might not be the case. And we do see that here, that the performance is best in terms of the 3 scenarios if we were to remove the 10 from Toy Town rather than either splitting or taking them for Anytown. We see that in our emergency performance and also our priority performance. So that's at force level. If we then go down to division level, we can see much bigger differences. So baseline for Division 1 performance for emergencies had been 76.7. If we were to take 10 out from Anytown, that performance drops to 55%. So that to me suggests that's definitely not a viable solution. What we can see there is actually, if we take 10 from Toy Town, that doesn't really affect D1, but it's taken about 8 points off performance in D2. So you start to see the differences that you would get from doing that, and actually have some discussions around where the optimal place to move those resources from would be. But if we're moving resources around, the other thing to be thinking about is what happens to utilization. So in the baseline, our operational utilization is averaging 51%. about 59 at Anytown and 45 at Toytown. Now, if we were to take, if we started off at 59 at Anytown, if we remove a further 10 people from Anytown, that 58.9 jumps up to 75.2. So it becomes far bigger than we would see from the Toytown utilisation. So there's a couple of factors in there. There's performance, but there's also resource utilisation, and be able to see the difference that different approaches would have there. So a couple of useful metrics as we go through them. Certainly my view in terms of what the best thing to do here, in terms of as we've gone through that, would be to take the 10 from Toytown. Then we'll maybe get into some discussions later on about additional things you can do around dispatch logic. And speaking of dispatch logic, one of the things we want to talk about is ring fencing, or the impact of allowing people to cross these imaginary borders. So just to explain quickly, and I'm sure most of you have done this in the training, but I think it can be useful just to go back through. When you get to the dispatch screen, which we'll show in a second, so this piece here with allocation restrictions, there's a couple of options that you might consider. So if we had no restriction at all, there's no constraint, resources can go across the whole force. Now that's fine. It means that you're not, you get some economies of scale, you can move, you have movement, but it may mean that someone who starts their shift here ends up traveling consistently long journeys to get to incidents in the south, for example. You might have, okay, you just got to stay within your own dispatch group. So District 1, so may patrol from here, they've got to stay within their dispatch group. Then we get a little bit more complex. Dispatch group or a 20-minute drive. So basically, if we were to start in Northampton, in where the cursor is just now, we can go to any of the incidents in District 1, and we're allowed to go into District 2 as long as that incident was within 20 minutes. So you would be able to go to any of the area that in the red that is covered by this grey drive zone ring. And finally, one that we don't see very often, but we occasionally used is stay within your dispatch area and don't go further than 20 minutes, which would be, you could go to anything in Northton and some of the bits in Eastland, depending on whether or not they were still within the grey area. Hopefully that explains a little bit about the options that as you're applying them, which come into the emergency and non-emergency allocation restrictions. And in some forces, they'll have no restriction, or they have no or limited restrictions on the emergencies and tighter restrictions on the non-emergency piece. It very much depends how your force is set up. And the allocation restrictions are there to mirror the behaviour that we see. So if you've got sector boundaries that nobody ever crosses, never leave a BCU type thing, then that's certainly something you'd want to factor in. Whereas if people are able to move about more freely, you'd also want to know that. I've made a mistake here, as I've done. So this first piece, the allocation restriction on this baseline setup, the screenshot should show stay within your dispatch group. And from that, you can see below that everyone is staying within their dispatch group. So Anytown station location has resourced 2,044 jobs from their own dispatch group, but 0 from other dispatch groups. Similarly, Toytown doing the other piece there. So you see that people are staying within their dispatch group. If, in the case that resources could go anywhere, how do we know that that's happening, and what does it mean? So the allocation restrictions has been set to none rather than stay in your dispatch group. And what we'll see here is that not only are people going from Anytown to their own dispatch group, but they would also be picking up work in other dispatch groups as well. So you're able to see those differences in the deployment. We've got somewhat movement around borders, and really what we see here is that Anytown is receiving some support from Toytown, and similarly Toytown does get some support there. So it is a symbiotic relationship there. It's not just a one-way relationship, but it's useful to see how that plays out. So if we start to look at the impact of crossing borders, that can actually have quite a big impact on performance. So just by allowing people to dispatch anywhere, our emergency performance for the force goes up by 2.8%. we see District 1 going up by 9 points, but District 2 doesn't see that increase. In fact, it sees a drop. So what's happening there is the District 2 resources, and they're the ones that have more resources, they're being sent or dispatched across into District 1. So we see some of those changes. And then at a beat level, both Eastland and Northton see an increase, and you've got small reductions in Southmead and Westbury as well. So it's important to understand that when we change that dispatch logic, it can have quite a fundamental impact on who's going where and the performance that generates. It's very quiet so far. Any questions? Anything anybody want to pick up on?
No, I'm good so far, Ali.
You're doing a great job, Ali. Thanks very much. No, I shall crack on then. Okay, so allowing for the border, crossing the border has increased the performance. We've seen that. One of the things it will also do, because you're moving resources across borders and sectors, is it will have an impact on the resource utilization, and possibly in a couple of areas that you would expect. So anytime it started off at 58.9, Toy Town 45.3, previous piece. So what I wanted to show is just by running that changing scenario and saying we can go anywhere, what is the implications? So Toy Town, the bigger resource pool, are now spending a lot longer at scene because they're going to more incidents, and they're seeing a large increase in their travel time. So their utilization has gone up by 5.5 points, whereas Anytown has come down slightly. So actually the effect of this is balancing things out because people can travel. And that's not really a problem, but it's things that we need to be aware of. If we ring fence by saying stay in your dispatch group, you do lose some economies of scale. You don't have the ability to get, it's almost like silo working. You're not leaving the area, so you're not getting resources that are available and to help. But actually, there can be a benefit to that. So some of the forces we've done work with, you look at some of the proportions of time that people spend driving to incidents, and it can be massive that they're getting sent for 25, 30-minute drive to get to a grade 2, grade 3 incident. And actually, that means that it leaves the area that they've come from without any resource. So if an emergency comes in there, people are then having to drive from other areas, and just overall the force ends up doing a lot more driving. And although that's bad for response, it's also bad for vehicles, the environment, I suppose, as well. So it's things that we need to be aware of on there. So that point on ring fencing can mean losing economies of scales, but it also can help to balance out performance across different areas. So it's worth bearing in mind. One caveat we've got in this is being aware of modelling versus reality. So in some forces, just saying we're allowed to go across these borders in terms of changing the dispatch rule, that might not change the hearts and minds. But there's certain places where we've worked before that say I won't leave my BCU. I don't cross sector boundaries, and we see that within the data. So there's a question there about how that's going to have to be played out. Difference between model and what you would see in reality. There's also a caveat as well. There is a way of doing this in terms of keeping the dispatch logic as you would, but you can go through the travel matrix and put X's. And wherever you put an X, that there will be no way of going from that location to that beat. Now you can put those in, and it means that you can get quite fancy with the way in which you do your dispatch logic. I've got a massive concern with it because it means if someone picks up your model 6 months later and their travel matrix has an X, there's no way of taking that X out without having to find what that number should have been. So just be aware. I would also always be looking to create a separate sheet there that says these are the travel matrices that were used within Response Profiler. But yeah, obviously there is some functionality that you can use there, but it's worth bearing in mind there are some drawbacks to that. Okay, final piece from me on double crewing. So considerations around double crewing. What do we need to think about? So with double crewing, the idea is we're sending out vehicles, and Response Profiler uses vehicles, but we need to know how many people are being rostered and how many people are turning up after abstraction and how many people go into those vehicles. So within the model, we've got our resources, which the grid would be on the right-hand side here, and the line that says double crewing. What's the double crewing percentage here? Now, no one on the call is from the Fed, and I think that would be, certainly I wouldn't suggest this at all. What we're saying here, we've put 0% double crewing throughout. So this is one of the scenarios to say, if we were a single crew, absolutely every vehicle, what level of performance would we get? It's dead easy to do the model. We go through the shifts and we change the double crewing rate to 0%. So what we get is if we put this through the model, I've done two scenarios, one with we've got the baseline, and then the two scenarios being one where we're always single crewed and one where we double crew absolutely everything we can. And as you'd expect, we do get some massive swings in performance. Plus 12% in emergency performance if we single crewed everything. Dropping by 25% if we double crewed everything. Those look like big numbers that we should be reporting, saying actually we need to single crew as much as possible. And to some extent that makes sense. But just changing these numbers in the model here doesn't necessarily give us a feasible solution. And it's the sort of the sense check and overlay on that becomes really important. So yes, we're seeing a 12-point improvement, but we're single crewing absolutely everything. Do we have enough vehicles? Do we have enough response trained drivers? What do we do about probationers? There's so many concerns there, and that's before we overlay the whole part of almost every force I've spoken to has higher levels of double crewing on lates and nights than it would on earlies as a safety element. So it's things that we can change the model. That's dead easy to do. We can run it and we get outputs like this, but are they based on reality? So easy to change the model values. I think I've touched most of that. Double crewing rates at night, which tends to be a safety piece. Vehicles, students and probationary officers who require tutors, so you've got to double crew there. And that's the bits that you would say are fairly easy. But there's two other bits I really want to touch on because these tend to get overlooked when people just go, change the number in here, and that's what it's going to give us. And I purposely haven't changed anything else in there just to show this. But dispatch strategy. So if we single crew all of our vehicles, would we change the weight of attack? So for example, there's domestic taking place. Am I still going to send one unit? That I was historically, I would send one unit. Actually, now it's just one person that I'm sending, whereas in the past it used to be 1.5 or 2. Does it mean that we're actually going to create more deployments because of we need to have more officers on the scene rather than vehicles? And also, we've seen in our analysis that double crew units tend to spend 15 to 20% less time at incidents. So do we need to go back into our process times if we're going to single crew everything and elongate those processes? And that's before we take into account investigations. So other tasks are put into our models as vehicle hours. Well, 2 people within those vehicle hours. If we start to go to single crew, how do we change the investigation numbers that are in there? So what looks like a very simple change of going from 30, 50, 75 down to 0 actually has some pretty wide-ranging implications that we've got to think about on there. So I think what I was trying to do here is one is double crew has become a massive question / bone of contention around the fact we have students. Just because we have more people doesn't necessarily mean that we have more vehicles out. And it brings some questions around it. Okay, in terms of a summary, sort of my learnings from putting this together, there's sort of 6 things that we think about. Are the changes that I'm making measuring the right thing? The example there, someone says it's a 10% change in demand. Does that mean it's a 10% change in attendances by response policing? And actually, maybe it is, but we've got to check that and make sure that it shouldn't be a 12% or a 9%, because that could have an impact on our findings. In terms of the find and replace, can we be as systematic as our approach to modelling as possible? So, yeah, the example with the grids is a good one, but also scenario modelling and being able to take that scenario sheet and just plonk your numbers down can be really useful. I always have a piece when I'm doing training courses of asking a question similar to what we did earlier around what do you expect to happen before you press run simulate? And are we seeing the results mirroring our expectations? And that's not to say our expectations will always be right, but are we at least thinking through in that process of are our outputs or results that we're seeing sensible? Are the solutions feasible and sensible? Double crewing is a great example. What you run in a model isn't necessarily applicable to the real world. So it's about making sure practitioners are involved in those discussions. And then finally, knock-on effects of the response model. By changing one thing, it possibly has an impact on some of the other inputs, and it's being aware of how those will change, I think, can be really useful. That's my main points. The final one, I think it comes back to any simulation we do, is the change that we're seeing statistically significant? So I've seen a lot of people report back and say, and that's making a 0.2 change in the model at a station ground, like at a station ground or at a peak level. There's always a question there of, is that really is that statistically significant, or is it just a factor of not running the model for long enough and what's going on there? So is it really a change, or is it a model effect or a real world effect would be my thinking behind it. Now, you've all been very quiet so far, and I appreciate that you let me present, but there must be some questions coming up. So while I'll let you think of those questions that I'm expecting in the next few seconds, I just want to point you in the direction of some other support that we've got on Response Profiler. So obviously, if there are any questions as you're building these models and as you go through the refresh, we're always obviously happy to help through help desk or emails. But if you did want to watch some of these videos, we've got on the help hints and tips videos, so under support hints and tips, we've got previous webinars on new functionality, as well as the MSL, so the minimum staffing level piece, both of which I believe Mark did back in 2021. So I'm going to wrap up now, but I'm asking, are there any questions around the use of Response Profiler? Has that been helpful? Is there anything I haven't touched on that you wish I had? Please let us know. Okay.
Ali, Matthew and Alan have both got questions. Both got their hands up.
Go on, choose one then, Mark.
Actually, two Matthews. So I'm going to choose Alan because there are two Matthews with their hand up. So Alan, you go first.
I can't believe you. That's Mark and his anti-Matthew agenda.
It's pro-Alan agenda actually, but it's fine.
It's a pro-Alan agenda, right? Yeah.
So mine was just, do you know you touched on the single crewing and double crewing? I think that's going to be quite a significant point when we come back to doing our model. When we go back and look at sort of say the at scene time, does the model give us the sort of flexibility to put different at scene times in for different things? So could we put single crewed is X period of time and double crewed is X period of time, or is it just something we would like figure out in the background and then just input it as one average at scene time?
It tends to be the latter there in terms of you would figure that out. I think it's you do the calculation to put it in terms of what's the average on scene time. But I think it's a really good question in terms of if you're going to be varying your varying the number of crew you're putting out, that will obviously have an impact on your ability to be at the incident. If you're doing door-to-door type stuff, it's going to take longer if there's one of you rather than two. So yeah, certainly that's something that if you're doing different versions of the model that have different double crewing rates, it's something you to certainly be aware of on there. But there's not any specific functionality to say at 30% double crewing, our on time, our deal time is 40 minutes, but it's 50 minutes if there's more.
Thank you.
Mr. Rees.
Afternoon. Only a quick one for me. Other tasks. Well, the biggest problem we have with running the model is basically sort of quantifying the other tasks element, and in particular, the last few years, officers are saying they spend a lot more time on niche or crime recording and things like that, which is taking up even more time. And it's just really, what would be the general consensus around forces about how much time response officers spend on other tasks? Now, I've done it from, as you're aware, we did activity analysis, which was 2 years ago now, pre-COVID, and we was going to redo that again, just to get an understanding of how much time is spent on incident-related activities opposed to other activities. Now, last time we did it, it was depend on each sector, but we're talking probably on average about 55% of their time on other tasks, albeit that included custody duties and things like that. But it was just really what was the, your average across all the forces that you've dealt with, really, for that type of thing.
Yeah, and I suppose I'll jump in, but I'm sure the guys will, or can others will jump in here. The tough pad revolution never materialized, in the sense of, I think 3 to 4 years ago, that the promise that our officers are not going to be doing so much admin, and all be done on surface pads and be able to stay out. We still see with a lot of forces, you see people returning to the office on there. I think that 55%, it's a difficult one because it depends on the structure. Some response models are purely response, and then they're handing things over. Golden hour and things go very quickly. Whereas others, they pick it up and they have more of investigation side of things. So that does come up. So you've also touched on custody there as well. I think certainly I've seen 3 or 4 forces where response officers end up picking up a lot of scene guards and cell watches and things at custody, because they're the response officers nearest custody. It all depends on how the structure and how it's implemented. But I'm not sure if any of my colleagues want to jump in with a better answer.
I'll jump in with an alternative. No, a supporting answer. I think the first thing is I'm laughing because it's our revenge at being able to say it depends, because I get so frustrated in other tasks workshops where the answer to every question you ask is, well, it depends. But actually, I think in this case, it does. I certainly, well, first of all, it depends. So over the last 5 or 10 years, obviously, as resources have become more constrained, the proportion of their time they're spending on incidents has gone up and the amount of proactive time has gone down. But broad brush for a force where the response cops pick up a fair amount of ongoing crime investigations, I'd be expecting them, my starting point would be to expect them to spend between about 40 and 50% of their time on incident related work, maybe 20 to 25% of their time on crime related work, and then maybe 10 to 15% on other work, with a little bit of slack for incident response resilience. But that would be sort of my starting point. If I'm getting the data and it's within 10% of those numbers, I'm fairly comfortable with it. If it's further out, then I'd want to understand why. But it's obviously contextual as to what, as Ali says, what the response cops pick up in that particular force.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
I don't know. Sorry, I did just throw that out. So probably, obviously, Mark and I have only worked with certain forces, but the forces that are on the call just now, so South Wales, North Wales, and Cleveland. Does that sound about right in terms of the proportions that we're saying there? Does that sound similar to what you've got, or would you expect things to be quite different?
Yeah, for us in North Wales, that seems fairly similar. The other tasks is the bit that we tend to have the most sort of challenges with in terms of using that to validate the models, if you like. It does tend to vary across areas because they're obviously resourced for more than just the response element.
Yeah.
Typically, what we find is busier, more urban areas have less time on other tasks compared to sort of more rural areas that have higher levels of other tasks, because they are largely resourced for the cover of the 24/7 aspect more than the demand they face, if you like. That question did make me wonder whether or not, is it possible to have no other tasks actually, and then somehow infer from the utilization? So having no other tasks, does it give you a view of what you need purely for response only? And then the utilization may give you some indication as to the gap that remains, or is that too simplified? Yeah,
because my training model has exactly that. Sorry, I think we don't have other tasks in the training model at the moment. Where is it? Yeah, so there you see the this one is running at 51%. Obviously, these are completely made up, but yeah, you could run it without any other task. It shows you your operational utilization and your overall utilization. There's elements about the fact you'd want to put the tasks in around. You'd assume that people take meal breaks. You'd assume that some of the work needs to be investigation, and also there's an element there, I suppose. If you just resource to that 51%, you're maybe not getting the economies of scale that you require, and also any form of resilience. But yeah, it's a fair challenge that you can run that to understand that's what we need to just do the response element. But there is obviously those other factors that that need to be accounted for. My biggest
But
bugbear.
also, can you realistically just drop another task? So I think you always are going to be in a position where you can't just drop another task to respond. So it's all very well to say we'll not include other tasks, but that could cause some problems.
Yeah, I think that my biggest bugbear with other tasks is the fact that they tend not to be recorded very well. So things like, right, let's talk about scene guards in North Wales, for example. How often do you get scene guards, and then you start to get into the detail behind that, and actually you find out that the data isn't held very well, or it's not accounted for, and sometimes it'll be neighbourhood that do it, but if there's a response officer nearby, well, they might pick it up, and there's no hard and fast rules for a lot of this stuff because of the way it's put together. So it can be very challenging, and I think one of the things that we've really worked on is trying to get as much out of the workshops as possible, those other task workshops as possible, and then validating it with the sergeants, the chief inspectors, etc., to really say, is this what your people are doing? Is it what you want them to do? And what's the alternatives? Because it comes back to, is the model based on fact, or is it based on what we want it to be able to do, which is a bit different.
Okay, thanks.
Did you also had your hand up for another question, did you?
Oh, yeah, it was just about, do you ever find that it works best to produce a response profiler model based on the whole force, or by, say, divisions, which have split into those sort of districts, or does it not really make much difference either way?
I think I'm going to throw to Mark in a second, but I think my view would be it depends on how BCU borders work. So if, for example, you had 4 districts that we've got here, and they were all resourced out, they reached it was 4 areas, and they were each reserve using their own resource, and they never went across borders, then actually, yeah, it could make sense to have 4 models and get into the details behind them. But if there is going to be the crossing of borders, then actually sometimes it's useful to have the whole force in there. Mark, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, it's a little bit swings and roundabouts, isn't it? Depending on the scenario that you're trying to run at that particular time, might point you in a certain direction. So if you're doing a scenario that was focusing on the resourcing of one particular geographical area, and you've got 10 geographical areas in your force, and there's an argument that says, well, why am I running the whole force model that's taking, for argument's sake, 10 times as long just to do this one scenario? However, as Ali says, as soon as there's any significant or noticeable cross-border working, then you would need to make some assumptions in the not resource percentages of your individual models to do that. I guess in an ideal world, you'd probably have both. So you'd have a force model that when you're doing force type scenarios, you can do generically across it, and you'd have separate geographical ones that if somebody was going to come in a particular area and want a scenario doing, you'd just use that. But that's a huge overhead to do that. I think over the years, and this is probably in parallel with what's happened to policing in general anyway, sort of moving away from BCU type models that they would have had 10, 15 years ago, I would say we've moved from 10 years ago, we would probably have tended to have separate geographical models for each geographical area, whereas now, provided the force isn't so large, so we wouldn't do this in the Met, for example, but now we would tend to have one model for the whole force.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Any further questions, or should we call that? Should we wrap it up? No. Okay. So,
hi, Ali. Sorry, Ali. It's Marie. Yes, just a quick question. Within South Wales Police, we don't tend to break our incidents down into different types. So whether it's crime or non-crime or specific categories of crime. Just interested if any other forces have done that and what the impact has been on their model, really.
I think typically we'd go by incident grade, and I get there's probably a bit there if you've got that you're going to have a multitude of grade ones, so that you've got district. We end up using or leaning on the distribution piece for those deal times. So say you say a grade 1 might be 35 minutes on average, but the distribution will take into account that some of them will be 5 minutes and some of them will be 4 hours. So that tends to be what we've used. I'm not sure I've actually got examples of where it's been broken out further. There's probably a couple of forces who've split their grade 2s out into, was the one who was grade 2 and a grade 2A or something that they had in there, just in terms of or I think they've got 2.1 in there. But yeah, I think there are a few examples where they've had data and they wanted to split it out because they might have different performance metrics in there, but possibly not, certainly not in my experience, by all the different incident types that you might see from that crime in the RAMP model. Mark?
Yeah, you're right, Ali. I think it's unusual that we would split it out beyond work stream, beyond grading type. I guess the thing to be wary of is sort of, so Ali doing is very first example today of what if demand increases or decreases by 20%. It's about having the full confidence and the full knowledge of what's gone into your baseline model. So actually the detail behind that scenario might be incidents are going to increase by 20%, but that's because we think the crime element of incidents is going to increase. If we've got an average scene time of 60 minutes in our baseline model, if all of the increase in demand is crime, they would tend to have a longer resource impact. Therefore, we'd need to revisit some of the other assumptions that are in the model to address the fact that actually it's not just the demand that's increased, but that would have a knock-on impact for time at scene. And it's similar to the example that Ali was talking about with Alan on double crewing. If we change the crewing, what of the other data points in the model does that potentially change?
Is that helpful, Marie?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks both.
Okay. So I'm going to wrap it up there. If you have any feedback, any questions, etc., please drop me a line. Our next webinar Wednesday will still be interesting, but might not be as interesting for police. We're talking about considerations for the optimal location of fire stations. But as I've been told, I could take the word fire out and put police in there, and it's probably a very similar presentation as well in there. So that's going to be on the 9th of March if you're interested. The one thing I have been asked to put across is the fact that if these webinar sessions are useful, if there are specific topics that you'd like us to go into, so it might be as niche as there's parts of response profile that we want to do half an hour on, more than happy to go into that in terms of what those look like going forward. Or if there's sessions we've done in the past, say actually it'd be really useful if you could repeat them for some of the team, we can do that too. So yeah, if you've got any feedback, please get in touch on that one. But yeah, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Ali.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.